The desert air was still warm on the evening it all burned down, not with fire, but with the quiet, suffocating venom of family. There is a moment of cognitive dissonance before a catastrophe, a brief, shimmering second where the unbelievable hangs suspended in the air. For me, it arrived with the scent of grilled corn and cilantro lime chicken, a meal I had prepared with hopeful hands. They told me my home, this sanctuary of glass and steel I had carved out of the Arizona landscape, was no longer mine. They had decided my life needed to be liquidated for their convenience. But the true gut-wrenching horror wasn't the audacity of the demand itself. It was the chilling, sudden clarity that this was not a whim. This was a final, tactical move in a chess game I never knew I was playing, a meticulously planned erasure of the one daughter who had dared to build a life beyond their shadow. I had been up since dawn, the early morning sun casting long, cool shadows across the polished concrete floors. Every surface gleamed. Every cushion was perfectly plumped. I'd arranged a centerpiece of desert succulents, their resilient, spiky forms a quiet testament to life in a harsh environment. It was my first real dinner party as a homeowner, a vulnerable offering to the three people whose approval I still craved with a primal, childish ache. The minimalist dining table was set with heavy, custom-made ceramic plates. Even the name cards, Cora, Arthur, Genevieve, Clara, were printed on thick, expensive cardstock, a small detail I hoped would convey respect and love. I still clung to a foolish, flickering hope that they would walk in and see me, not just the house, that they would see the years of relentless work, the sacrifices, the ambition that had propelled me to this point. I imagined my father, Arthur, looking at me without the cold, appraising gaze of a stock trader evaluating a portfolio. I pictured my mother, Genevieve, offering a genuine smile, her hand still for once, not compulsively inspecting for dust along the countertops or adjusting a frame that was already perfectly level. At precisely 6:35, the low hum of their imported sedan was followed by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. The sound sent a familiar spike of anxiety through my chest, a Pavlovian response honed over 3 decades. I smoothed down my linen dress, took a deep breath, and opened the heavy pivot-style front door with a smile I had practiced, a smile that pleaded, "Please, just for tonight, let us be a family." My sister Clara swept in first, her eyes doing a swift, critical inventory. "It smells ethnic," she commented, a delicate wrinkle forming on her nose. Her stilettos, sharp as daggers, clicked an annotation of disapproval on the floor I had spent an hour cleaning. She drifted toward the living area, her phone already in her hand. Arthur followed, his posture ramrod straight. His gaze went upwards, to the high ceilings and architectural lines. "Good square footage," he noted, his voice devoid of warmth. "A valuable piece of real estate. You were smart to build it with no interior load-bearing walls. It makes the space entirely reconfigurable for a future owner." "I am the owner," I said, my laugh a little too tight, a little too bright. "And I like this configuration." Genevieve entered last, a specter of silent judgment in a beige silk sheath. She didn't speak, but her gloved fingers trailed along a large piece of abstract art I'd bought with my first significant bonus, the gesture less a caress and more a forensic examination for flaws. The dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. The food I had so carefully prepared went largely untouched. Clara scrolled through her social media feed, occasionally showing a picture on her phone to Genevieve, their shared whispered comments creating a small exclusionary bubble. Arthur steered the conversation toward the economy, peppering his monologue with pointed questions about my construction loan, my interest rate, my property taxes. "A property of this magnitude carries a significant overhead for a single person, Cora," he said, laying down his fork. "It's a tremendous risk in a volatile market. One bad quarter, and you could be completely underwater." My career is stable, Dad. It's manageable, I insisted, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. No one asked about that career. No one congratulated me on the promotion that had made this all possible. It was as if my success was an inconvenient, slightly vulgar detail in the larger, more important narrative of their lives. When I brought out the key lime pie, its meringue perfectly toasted, Arthur placed his napkin on the table. It was a gesture of finality, a signal that the performative part of the evening was over. The look in his eyes was one I knew with a dreadful intimacy, the same detached, resolute look he'd had when he'd informed me, at 17, that my dream of being an artist was an unacceptable return on his investment in my education. "We've had a family discussion," he announced, his voice the smooth, unassailable baritone he used in boardrooms. "And we've made a decision. It's time to liquidate this asset." The air in the room seemed to crystallize. "I'm sorry," I said, the words catching in my throat. "What asset?" Genevieve gave a slight, dismissive wave of her hand, as if swatting away a gnat. "This house, dear," she said, her tone laced with a weary patience. "You've had your fun building it, but it's an impractical long-term investment. The market is peaking. We feel it's time to divest and reallocate the capital more strategically." Clara leaned back in her chair, a smug little smile playing on her lips. She had known this was coming. She was an actress in a play for which I'd never received a script. "It's just a strategic move, Cora," she said, parroting her father. "Nothing personal." "Your old room at the country club is always available to you," Arthur continued, as if offering a generous, benevolent concession. "We'll be putting this house on the market effective next week. Clara's realtor, a top performer in Paradise Valley, has already done a preliminary walkthrough." I shot to my feet, my chair scraping harshly against the concrete. The sound was a violation in the carefully curated quiet. "You're selling my house?" My voice was a choked, incredulous squeak. "Let's not be dramatic, Cora," Genevieve said, her voice a silken reprimand. "You're becoming hysterical." As if on cue, Clara stood and retrieved a sleek, expensive-looking suitcase from the entryway, where they had hidden it upon arrival. "My suitcase. The one I took on business trips." "We took the liberty of packing a few things for you," she said, her expression impassive, her duty performed. "Just to get you started, to make the transition seamless." My throat felt as though it were filled with desert sand. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My voice had abandoned me. "I am the legal owner," I finally managed to whisper, the words a ghost in the room. Arthur's smile was thin, a bloodless slash in his handsome face. It held no humor, only the cold confidence of absolute power. "Ownership," he said softly, "can often be a fluid concept." Tears would have been a surrender, a validation of their narrative that I was hysterical, emotional. I refused. With a stillness I didn't know I possessed, I walked to the table, picked up my phone and my wallet, and took the house key from my pocket. I laid it gently on the polished quartz countertop, the metal making a soft, final click. I didn't look at them again. I walked out into the cooling desert night, the suitcase a dead weight in the trunk of my car, thumping against the side with every turn like a second, mocking heartbeat. I drove without a destination, the glittering, indifferent lights of Phoenix and Scottsdale blurring into a meaningless smear. I ended up at a scenic overlook, parked in a nearly empty lot, the entire valley spread before me like a carpet of diamonds. It was beautiful and vast and offered no comfort. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, not knowing who I could possibly call. And then, it buzzed in my hand, an unknown number. "This is Cora Holloway," I answered, my voice a stranger's. "Ms. Holloway." "This is Maria from Pinnacle Trust Bank," a crisp professional voice said. I'm calling from our fraud prevention department. I apologize for the late hour, but we needed to verify a request submitted today to transfer the title of your property at 72 Canyon Ridge Road. A cold dread, sharp and clean, washed over me. I didn't request any transfer. That's what we suspected, Miss Holloway. The request was to transfer the title to a family trust registered under the names Arthur and Genevieve Holloway. A pause. The primary issue is that the transfer was submitted with a notarized power of attorney document that was also dated today. Our system flagged it as highly irregular. The signature on the POA does not appear to be a strong match to your verified signature on file. Power of attorney? I whispered, the words tasting like poison. I have never signed a power of attorney. We assumed as much, Maria said, her tone softening with a hint of sympathy. The property title remains solely in your name. We have placed a high-level security freeze on the account and all associated assets, and we have logged this as a fraudulent attempt. A full report will be available for you. I'm very sorry you're dealing with this, Ms. Holloway. I hung up, the silence in the car ringing in my ears. The raw shock began to curdle, hardening into a cold, terrifying certainty. This wasn't just a hostile takeover. This was a premeditated, criminal act. I drove back toward my home as the sun began to rise, painting the stark mountains in brutal shades of orange and pink. My keycard was useless. The smart lock on my front door flashed a single, malevolent red light. Access denied. I stepped back. The custom-made steel planter I'd commissioned was gone, replaced by a generic pot of succulents that screamed staging company. The door opened before I could knock. A sharply dressed woman in her 40s, holding a tablet, stood there. Her smile was polished and predatory. "You must be Cora," she said, her tone sickeningly sweet. "This is my house," I stated, my voice flat and hard. She gave a practiced, sympathetic tilt of her head. "Arthur and Genevieve, such a lovely couple. They told me you might stop by. They mentioned you've been going through a very difficult time and that you might be a bit confused about the situation." My jaw tightened until it ached. Gaslighting. It was their native tongue. Behind her, I could see my living room had been rearranged. My art was gone. My personal photos were gone. My home had become a sterile, soulless showroom. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property," she said, her tone shifting from sympathetic to firm as I didn't immediately retreat. "The owners have requested privacy." I walked away without a word, my heels clicking on the travertine walkway. My neighbor, Mrs. Diaz, a kind, watchful widow with a magnificent cactus garden, was retrieving her newspaper. She met my eyes, her own dark eyes filled with a deep, unspoken concern. She knew this was wrong. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a small gesture of solidarity that meant the world. I drove straight to my best friend Maya's condo downtown. She was my chosen family, the sister of my heart. I sat on her balcony overlooking the city, the heat rising in waves from the streets below, and for hours I couldn't speak. When I finally found my voice, the words came out in a torrent of disbelief and pain. Maya listened, her expression shifting from wide-eyed shock to a cold, protective fury. "This wasn't an argument, Cora. This was a goddamn ambush," she seethed. "They had a script, a suitcase, a realtor, and a forged legal document. This is a conspiracy. You need a lawyer, not just a lawyer. You need a shark." That evening, we went back to my house. The realtor was gone. Through the vast, uncurtained windows, I could see Clara inside, directing two men who were carefully wrapping my furniture in plastic and moving it into a large storage pod parked in my driveway. She was laughing, pointing, completely at ease as she dismantled my life. Mr. Julian Croft was a man whose quiet demeanor belied a formidable reputation. He listened to my entire story without interruption, his gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, he took a slow sip of water. "This is distressingly common," he said, his voice calm, "particularly among wealthy families where assets are viewed as communal, regardless of legal title. Greed, wrapped in the language of family concern, is a potent combination." He looked at the fraudulent power of attorney document I'd obtained from the bank. "This, however," he said, tapping the forged signature, "this is a felony. They have given us the weapon we will use against them. Our first step is to put them on notice that the game has changed." That night back at Maya's, I began my own investigation. I dug deep into my cloud storage, pulling up every document I could find. And then I saw it, a folder from 2 years ago labeled Family Estate Planning. Inside was a stack of scanned documents Arthur had insisted I sign. He'd brushed off my questions at the time. "Just standard formalities, Cora, to protect our assets in case something happens." I had been so desperate for his approval, so eager to be seen as a responsible part of the family, that I had signed without reading every line. Now, I read them. Buried in the jargon was a limited power of attorney, giving him control over my assets under specific, vaguely defined circumstances. The circumstances he and my mother had now apparently decided had been met. Mr. Croft filed a cease and desist and a request for an emergency temporary restraining order. The response was a voicemail from Arthur, his voice a low, controlled growl. "You have no idea the trouble you've just invited into your life, Cora. You should have been grateful." The trouble came swiftly. A notice from my bank. My accounts were frozen due to a disputed ownership claim filed by Arthur's lawyers. An alert from a credit bureau notified me of an attempt to open a massive business line of credit using my name and social security number. They weren't just after the house. They were trying to financially ruin me, to leave me with no resources to fight back. My Aunt Isabel called, her voice dripping with the faux concern of a designated family peacekeeper. "Darling, you're creating such an awful scene. Can't you just sit down with your father and work this out? Think of the family's reputation." "He is trying to steal my home and ruin me financially," I said, my voice cold. "Well, you know Arthur is under a lot of pressure at work. You have to be more understanding of his position." I laughed, a raw, humorless sound. "Understanding. I'm done understanding, Isabel. Now, I'm documenting." I hung up. The final piece of evidence, the smoking gun, arrived in the most unexpected way. An email, late one night. It was from Arthur's primary accountant, a man I'd met a few times, but he hadn't sent it to Arthur's personal address. In his haste, he had sent it to a generic Holloway family email group that included me. The subject line read, "Urgent, Henderson Project Collapse." My heart pounded as I read, "Arthur, the numbers are catastrophic. We need to liquidate a major unencumbered asset immediately to cover the margin calls before the end of the quarter. Is the Canyon Ridge property ready to list? We need that capital freed up within 30 days, or we are facing total insolvency." It was never about my well-being or a strategic move. It was about a failed business deal. My home, my success, my life. It was their bailout plan. I forwarded the email to Mr. Croft with a single word: checkmate. The courtroom was cold and sterile. My family sat at the opposing table, a united front of offended dignity. Arthur, in a perfectly tailored suit, looked like the pillar of the community he pretended to be. His lawyer argued that they were acting in my best interest, that my extravagant lifestyle had put the family's good name at risk, and that the power of attorney gave them the right to intervene. When it was his turn to speak, Arthur stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice resonant with false sincerity. "We love our daughter. We are simply trying to help her. She has clearly become overwhelmed by her circumstances." When I took the stand, I did not speak of betrayal or pain. I spoke of facts. I presented the deed to my house, paid for with my money, the mortgage documents solely in my name, the fraudulent power of attorney, the security footage, and finally, the email from the accountant. I turned to look at my father. My father is not trying to help me, I said to the judge, my voice steady and clear. He is in financial distress because of his own failed business dealings. He is trying to steal my home to cover his losses. He sees my success not as a source of pride, but as a resource to be plundered. The judge's decision was immediate and unequivocal. The restraining order against my family was made permanent. He announced he was referring the evidence of wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to the State Attorney General's office. I watched the color drain from Arthur's face. For the first time in my life, I saw a crack in his armor of absolute control. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked me what I would do now. I looked straight into the camera. I'm going to go home. Reclaiming the house was a quiet, deliberate exorcism. It took days. I threw out the sterile, soulless furniture they'd staged. I tore down the curtains Genevieve had chosen. I found a manipulative, non-apology letter she had left on the counter filled with phrases like, "One day you'll understand this was an act of love." I burned it in my outdoor fire pit, watching the lies turn to ash and drift away into the vast desert sky. Clara came by a week later, an unannounced, transparent attempt at damage control. "I never wanted it to go this far, Cora," she began. "You wanted the house, Clara," I replied calmly, not letting her inside. "You were happy to take it. You just didn't want the fight that came with it. You don't get to play the victim now that you've lost." The final communication was a typed letter from Arthur, delivered by a courier. It was a page of justifications about market forces and difficult decisions, ending with the line, "I was only doing what I believed was best for the family's financial stability." It was not an apology. It was a closing statement from a man incapable of admitting fault. I filed it away in a box labeled "Closed." On New Year's Eve, I sat by my pool, the warm desert air a soft, gentle blanket around me. The city lights twinkled in the distance. They could calculate the market price of a house down to the last cent, but they had never understood the value of a home. They saw an asset to be liquidated. I saw a sanctuary I had built, a testament to my own strength. True ownership, I realized, isn't a name on a deed or a number on a balance sheet. It's the peace you build within walls you can call your own, a peace that no one can foreclose on. This house wasn't just property, it was proof. And it was, finally and irrevocably, mine.